Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schuff along with William Swig. William, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. We are pleased to welcome a legend in the objectivist world, someone I've had the chance to work with recently. He's the author of Who is John Galt Anyway? He writes Symposium and the Tracinski Letter on Substack, and current Atlas Society Senior Fellow, Robert Tracinski. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. I've really been enjoying, by the way, having you as sort of a quasi-host on the clubhouses.
Yes, I was going to talk about that, and I was probably as pro-Trump as you were anti-Trump, and when you started doing the clubhouse sessions, maybe 6 months ago, I came in somewhat skeptical about you, and I was asking some pretty pointed questions, and I have to say you stood there and took those questions, and I came to respect you for that. In fact, when they asked me to start hosting clubhouse sessions for you on Tuesday, which right now they're 7:30 p.m. Eastern, on the Clubhouse app, I was surprised that you were even open to and not vetoing me as host after some of my questions. So I appreciate that you're not the type wanting an echo chamber.
Oh yeah, I like good questions. I like tough questions. I mean, it makes it more interesting actually to be able to answer those, and to be able to give my and also get somebody else's perspective on things. So I mean, I just finished. A friend of mine does meetups under the title 52 Living Ideas. We just did a session of like 10 of them on the Fountainhead, talking going through the parts of the novel and talking about them, and it's interesting that you get people with very different perspectives on it, people with very different reactions. We had this whole sort of debate over team Dominique versus team Dagny as to which basically the people who, like me, who think Dominique's totally crazy, and which the line is in the book where the editor, the assistant editor for the Banner, what's his name, Alvis Garrett, says to her, "Are you totally crazy?" And I'm thinking, yes, she is, because I never really quite understand. I understand that character, but I don't quite sympathize, but as much as other people do. But we had some people who are big Dominique fans, so we talked it out, and so you have to get those different perspectives and see what other people's reactions are, and you get a whole different angle on things. So I think disagreement and that kind of discussion it's good for us intellectually to deal with that.
Absolutely. I mean, now speaking of that, we did a show in response to the Ayn Rand Institute's essay trying to justify all of their past schisms or disagreements, and the Atlas Society came out with a response to that essay. You also wrote about it on your Substack page, and we'll get into that as well. But I want to start just with a little bit of your background and history of the movement. I first heard about you with the Intellectual Activist in the 90s, but how did you get introduced into Ayn Rand and end up at ARI?
Well, okay, so the interesting thing is I started out, the funny part is I started out with a copy of Atlas Shrugged on my bookshelf when I was like 10, 12 years old. It was my dad's old copy. He'd moved a bunch of books into my room, and there it was sitting there. But it was next to a book by Albert Camus, and I read some of Albert Camus, and I thought it was the worst, most terrible. I hated the existentialists. Worst, most terrible book I've ever read. I think it was The Myth of Sisyphus. It's like how the myth of Sisyphus. He rolls the rock up to the hill, and just as it's getting to the top, it rolls down. And Camus basically says, "Well, life is basically like that, and the only real question is why not commit suicide." And I thought the existentialists were just a bunch of whiners, and so the thing is that the Ayn Rand is right next to that, and there's this big thick book, this odd cover. It was the old one with like the face and the world breaking apart, and
I had that one.
Author with a strange foreign name. I thought this must be another existentialist. I'm not going to touch that. But the funny thing is that I actually end up arguing against. I came into Objectivism by arguing against it. So I had a friend a guy named Robert Garmong, who is still sort of occasionally does a few things here and there in the movement.
Yeah.
And we were in high school together. We were friends, and he started reading it, became very interested and very engaged, and very much arguing in favor of her perspective. And I was like, oh, no. It wasn't the politics I disagreed with. I liked the politics. It was, the metaphysics and the epistemology. And I was like, well, you can't really say this. You can't really say that. And I kept trying to argue with him, but I realized there was enough there I had to engage with it. So I said, okay, fine. I'm going to pick up Atlas. I have got this Atlas Shrugged on my shelf. I'm going to go pick it up. I'm going to read it. And but that wasn't enough. So I got like 200 pages into Atlas Shrugged, and I put it down because I thought, well, it's well written, it's engaging, it's really drawing me in, but the world just doesn't work like that. I don't think it's her view of the world is realistic. And then there was this period of a couple of months where I'd be reading the newspaper and I'd see something and think, oh, that's just like something out of Atlas Shrugged. Or I'd watch the TV and some world event. And, oh, that's just like something out of Atlas Shrugged. And there was that slow drip of those things that made me realize, well, wait a minute, maybe this is more realistic than I gave it credit for. So I read through the rest of Atlas Shrugged, and then I still had objections. I still had things that need to be answered. So the next thing I picked up, it's not a natural next step, but my next thing I picked up was Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. I have a vivid memory of this. I was in my, I was working as a dishwasher at a Holiday Inn. And during my break, I was reading Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, a 17-year-old kid. And I got to the chapter on axiomatic concepts where it's like, she finally gets down to, here is the justification. Here's the validation of the axioms. Here's the whole foundation of the system. And having that sort of light bulb moment when I realized what she was doing with that, and everything sort of fell into place from there. And I, went off, got a degree of philosophy, University of Chicago, but, that thing about reading the newspaper and thinking, oh, this is like something I've Atlas Shrugged. That was sort of the premonition, although I didn't know it at the time, of my future career, which was to basically to go write about the news and point out to people, hey, this is just like something out of Atlas Shrugged.
And it seems to happen much more often these days. Go ahead, William.
Yeah, I'm curious, what motivated you to keep investigating Ayn Rand's ideas? Most people, and myself included, have this kind of epiphany when we first hear about objectivism or read Ayn Rand, and it just kind of clicks. We're like, this is the way the world is. But you seem to have the opposite take, and you kept with it. And what motivated you to do that?
Well, okay, so my resistance to it was basically that I was a teenage Kantian. So like I was a teenage werewolf. I was a teenage but no, I was very interested in philosophy. And unusually so for somebody, I was 17 when I first read Atlas Shrugged, but I would, I basically discovered the field of philosophy at 15 or 16. But I discovered it by way of some things that I now realize were sort of like secondary, translated, popularized Kantianism. So the whole Kantian thing of, well, you have these categories through which you filter everything, so you can't really know the world as it really is. All that was really very much in my head. And so that was part of, and then of course I read Nietzsche, and there was some stuff about Nietzsche that attracted me, but again, very subjectivist in the field of ethics. The funny thing is, politics was the only thing that I didn't fight against Ayn Rand at all on. It was like, her politics is like, oh yeah, I get that immediately. I totally understand and I agree with it. But it was, can there be a rational foundation for ethics, and can there be a rational foundation for reason itself, for a belief in objective knowledge? So I had, because I was engaging with, real philosophical ideas at a young age, I had absorbed these sort of Kantian assumptions without knowing what they really were. And so that was why I was sort of like, resistant to it. But at the same time, here's the thing, I came to Ayn Rand through Carl Sagan, is the way I would put it. And it may seem odd if you consider his politics are very left liberal and that sort of thing. But, I was one of these people who was, I was like 11 years old or so when the Cosmos series came out, the billions and billions. When the Cosmos series came out, I was 11 years old. It would totally bowled me over. I watched it obsessively, and it had a big impact on me. And the basic message of that was pro-science, pro-reason. The idea, one of the themes that he hits on early on, he talks about Pythagoreans. He talks about the idea of having to follow the facts wherever they lead, and without, and he has a great section on Johannes Kepler, talking about how he had these sort of rationalistic theories about how the orbits of the planets could be explained by the perfect Pythagorean solids, and this very Pythagorean, very Platonic approach, and how he threw all that out because it didn't match the data, and then came up with this new theory. So this idea that you have to follow the truth wherever it leads, you have to stick to reason and not be you sort of, not stick to your preconceived notions or pre-existing ideas. That regard for reason and for science had a huge impact on me, and I think that's what sort of gave me the idea that, okay, I'm resisting Ayn Rand, I'm arguing against her views, but I have to know what they are, right? I have to understand them before I can reject them. And
Right.
the idea that I actually have to follow these ideas down. And I think I sensed also that, I'm as a 17-year-old quasi-Kantian, I sensed that my arguments were not all that ironclad, and that there was something there in her writing that was bigger and more powerful than that I couldn't just dismiss it, and I had to investigate more. So I sort of read it literally on the grounds of, I have to understand this so I can refute it. And of course, by the time I understood it, I couldn't refute it. I accepted it. So it was just, it was the fact that I had a regard for reason, and I think that was the thing that, I have to understand this thoroughly and firsthand and without bias before I can dismiss it.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. How did you find your way to the Ayn Rand Institute?
Well, so I went off to college. Bob Garmong and I we went to high school together. We went to college together, and the first thing we did when we showed up at the University of Chicago in 1987 was we started an Objectivist club there. And at the time, I don't know if how much I've heard this sort of withered a little bit, but at the time they had a very extensive campus club network. And the great thing about ARI, and what brought me into their orbit, was the fact that they had this sort of organizational stuff they provided some organizational help. They provided a board of speakers that we could bring in. But
Right.
the thing is that they had also would bomb you with, okay, here's a bunch of pamphlets, here's a bunch of reading material. At the time, now this is pre-internet, so at the time, if there were all these lectures that they had on audio cassette, and they'd send these out on audio cassette that you'd have,
I remember.
yeah, and you had to send them back, of course, because audio cassettes were a valuable commodity. It's very, very, it's primitive by today's standards, but we had an engaged enough group there of, maybe 3 or 4 of us who were interested in doing this. So we get together on the weekends because, we're University of Chicago students, so we're a bunch of geeks who have nothing better to do. and we would listen to these lectures, and it was like this tremendous amount of knowledge coming in. I think it's the advantage that the ARI has to this day too, is that they've got a lot of philosophical lectures and articles and things like that they can push out to a new person who's coming in there who just wants to use absorbing all this stuff. And by the way, this is Leonard Pickoff's sort of big compendium on his big codification of the philosophy was still being written at the time. I mean, it didn't come out until 91 or 92, I think.
Right.
So we were getting a lot of that stuff in the form of lectures and things like that. So, there was much less of a place. You couldn't just buy a book and say, okay, I'm going to systematically go through her philosophy piece by piece in one book, like you can with that book now. So we're getting it all through the lectures, and that was sort of what grew it. And I went to some of the conferences that they were doing, the summer conferences, which they made it easy for a student who basically has no money to go and attend these things, and made contacts there. And we brought in a number of speakers, John Ridpath. Those who are old enough to remember John Ridpath know what an engaging speaker and an engaging personality he was. So we brought him in a couple times to talk at the University of Chicago. Actually, our biggest campus club triumph was in 1990, I think a spring of 1991. That or maybe fall of 91, I'm trying to remember. We brought in, we went to the Democratic Socialists on campus, and we co-sponsored a capitalism versus socialism debate. And we brought in 2 objectivists, and they brought in 2 of their people. And we got the biggest audience we've ever had for any event, like 900 people. And this is 1991, so the wall was falling, Soviet Union was collapsing. So it was like it seemed like the last moment at which you could have a capitalism versus socialism debate. And that was like a real high point for us, a giant audience and a really, John Ridpath and Harry Binzinger were there on the capitalist side. And a really, they basically mopped the floor up with the other guys because, the other guys weren't really prepared for dealing with the arguments on that.
Because
why do you think
the better system?
Was that?
Well, why do you think that is? I've noticed that with the socialists, they're rarely prepared for anything.
Yeah, I think it's because, today we'd understand that they live, it's the filter bubble, right? They live in a bubble where they don't have to re-argue the foundations of their system all the time. And they're used to being surrounded by people who agree with them or people who echo their views back, or at worst dealing with conservatives who are ceding basic principles and premises to them. So I think they just weren't prepared to, and they're just, one of the innovations we introduced, one of the guys on our club came up with this, is that something you don't usually see in a debate where we had a point where each person on the stage could ask a question of the other side for them to answer.
I've seen that more recently. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was very nicely done, very politely done, but they basically asked them, how do you justify coercion? Basically, your system is going to have to be imposed by coercion. How do you justify the fact that you're going to be going around coercing people? Because they danced around this thing the whole time. And they really had no answer to that. I was like, it's such a basic fundamental thing to your philosophy. You have a whole philosophy that says that the government should be in the job of forcing people to do things all the time. And you don't have a good answer to why is coercion okay. So I think it's because they're not used to facing that sort of philosophical opposition. They're used to, one of the things that passed around the movement a lot back in the day, and probably still around somewhere, is there was and what inspired us is that there was a debate done in Toronto in 1984, where there was Leonard Pickoff and
that's a famous
against these two prominent Canadian socialists. And I remember watching that because there was this moment, and it was it sums up the late 80s in a lot of ways. There's this moment where one of the socialists there, who's a fairly prominent Canadian socialist, as I understand, is almost in despair. He's saying, like, we had this consensus and everybody was agreed that we had this consensus, and now people are questioning it. And it's like his world was crashing down around him because, I think they really, in the late 20th century, or sort of mid to late 20th century, they really thought we have this consensus, everybody's on board, everything's going our way. And they weren't prepared for the fact that somebody was going to come along and question their consensus at its very foundations, and they'd have to defend that. And I just think they weren't prepared.
You could say that exists with globalism today, but I assume that basically through this debate that you met some of the higher ups at ARI?
Oh yeah. And we brought them in bringing them in as speakers and going off to the conferences and that sort of thing. So so I was sort of a known quantity to ARI at the time, and
a philosophy degree helped.
Yeah, and the philosophy degree helped. And then after I had a couple of years after college where I had sort of been planning in my mind when I went off to college that I was going to go into academic philosophy. And by the time I was done with my undergraduate, I realized that's not what I wanted to do. That I didn't want to be an academic. It's partly because I didn't like academia. It's probably because I don't think I have the temperament for it. I like to say that if I were in academia, there'd be a permanent protest village outside my office. And also, I have some friends who are academics who have gone through this, and it really is, it's like 20 years of slaving away, as the low man on the totem pole, and then maybe you'll get a job with some security. But even, I've known some people who are tenured, who've gotten tenure now, and they're like, even tenure doesn't protect you that much anymore in this sort of woke era. Because, if you say something insensitive and are branded as a racist, that can get you in trouble, even if you're a tenured professor. So that idea of sort of like, but the main reason why I didn't go into academic philosophy, I think, is that I got interested in philosophy because I wanted to talk about the big questions what is the good? What is virtue? What is morality? Can we really know anything? I wanted to talk about the big questions, and I realized as I got in that in academic philosophy, you don't talk about the big questions, right? You talk about, you have to write the paper, you find some little niche and talk about very, very specialized little things, very technical details. And you don't spend as much time talking about the big issues. Whereas in the field I went into, which is journalism, which is, commentary on the news, you're talking about the big issues all the time, so some idiot decides to invade Ukraine, and you have to then talk about, well, how do you evaluate who's on the right, who's in the wrong? What is the philosophy that's animating Putin or Putinism? What does this say about the nationalist ideas? And there's all these different, the issue of why is it that Vladimir Putin did such a bad job of invading Ukraine? What is it about authoritarianism that undermines its ability to act effectively and to understand the world? So there's all these philosophical issues that just come up and are necessary for dealing with the events of the day.
Do you think part of it was just the sense that, I had it at the end of the Cold War, that it was just going to be a matter of time before Rand's ideas swept the culture?
I was never that confident of things, because I'd been in I got a degree in philosophy. I had an idea of what we're somebody once described it as, it's like sticking your head inside a cotton candy machine. So I had some idea of what it was like and how much work was really needed for these ideas to make headway. I do think, there was a moment of sort of, I would call it liberal euphoria. Now, using liberal in the proper sense of pro-freedom, that
Right.
in the early 2000s or late in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, they used to talk about the Washington Consensus. And it was the idea that basically that the American model was now accepted around the world as the Western liberal democratic model was now accepted around the world as the basic gold standard of what a government should be, and everybody was trying to work towards that, or at least the presumption was in favor of that kind of system. And it was before you had sort of an authoritarian backlash where they came up with rationalizations, new rationalizations and new ways of organizing authoritarian systems to try to revive that. So there was a certain period of euphoria, but I wasn't that optimistic about objectivism just taking over naturally. But
But you still joined in.
Go ahead.
You still joined in the early 90s, was it?
With what?
With the Ayn Rand Institute and the intellectual activist?
Okay, so yeah, well, there's a number. Okay, so we're talking about the movement stuff. So in the in the mid 90s, basically, when I got fired from a job writing about mutual funds, because I was like the world's most unmotivated employee. I did not want to write about mutual funds. And I was actually happy. I was like, one of the few things I didn't know what I was going to do for a living, but I was happy to be fired because I really did not, the prospect of not having to wake up in the morning and write about, I have nothing against mutual funds. I have shares in mutual funds. It was not what I wanted to do with my life. It was, I learned the lesson very early on that, some people I think can go do a day job for the money, but if the money is the only motivation, I just can't. It's nice to pay the bills, but I want to do something that is, I've always had the approach of since then of you have to do something that is motivating, that's interesting, that's engaging for me, because otherwise I'm not going to be that good at it. Okay. So I set out to become a writer, and in addition to then going to ARI's, it's called the Objectivist Graduate Center at the time, basically their graduate level training courses. In addition to doing that, I then I started doing some op-eds and things like that for ARI. But also what happened is that I briefly started my own publication called The American Republic, sort of a political newsletter. And I had known Bob Stubblefield, who was publishing The Intellectual Activist at the time. I'd known him since I was in college, but I'd known him over the internet. We were early internet adopters in 1988, before the internet had pictures. Right. I like to do I do my Jimmy Stewart voice. When I was a kid, the internet didn't have pictures. All we had was text. And it's really true. Back when it was just Usenet news groups and email, I had met Bob Stubblefield and gotten to know him.
Well,
And
you could make pictures, but it had to be all in like letters and everything.
yeah, all these used all the different characters, all the special characters.
Right. And it would take like an hour. It would take an hour to print out.
Yeah, but you could print out some pretty good. They had some good cheesecake photos going around that you could print out. I remember all that. But so anyway, I had this contact with Bob Stubblefield and knew him, and I did my own publication for about a year or so. And then the guy who was editing The Intellectual Activist, and I'd written a couple articles for them, he sent me this email that like I should let you know that I'm quitting. He wanted to go do something else. He says and just like I sure hope they can find somebody to replace me. And there was a definite aura of hint to that. So
that's nice.
So I called up Bob and I said, look, I'll close down my thing and join TIA, and I did that. And then a few years later, about 5 years later, that was 1996. And about 5 years later, Bob wanted to retire. I mean, he wanted to actually retire. And I took over publishing The Intellectual Activist, and changed the format and made it a bigger format and published it more often. But then what happened is in around 2004, I sort of saw the writing on the wall. I've got some good advice from a friend of mine, and we really saw the writing on the wall for what was happening with print publications, that print was becoming the slow and expensive way of delivering information. And so I started a Substack in 2004, right? This is like, 13 years before Substack actually existed.
Yeah.
But this was basically, cobbling together as best I could with the available technology, something that was essentially a Substack newsletter. So then that is what then, became the Tracinski letter. I renamed it in 2012. But that was, took TIA and took it online and turned it into an online publication.
Just as an aside, I was going to say, I noticed that Craig Biddle had his own publication. Even Kelly had a side publication when he was targeted. And just with you, I think I'm seeing a pattern here that if you have a side publication going while working at ARI, you may want to watch your step.
Well, I think it was, so let's talk about the ARI stuff. So starting in the late 90s, I worked for ARI and I wrote op-eds for them. We had a letter to the editor program for a while back when there was still such a thing as, I'm sure they still publish letters to the editor, but back when that was considered still an important way of communicating, right? An actual printed letter printed in the newspaper. And so we got this like group of people who were interested in writing these letters, and I would feed them, oh, here's something interesting to respond to. I give them advice on how to write them, things like that going on. That's the sort of thing I was doing for ARI. And what eventually happened is I became, as we got into the 2000s, I sort of disengaged starting around 2003 from ARI. And there were a couple of reasons. One is that, I didn't like all the terms they were giving me. I sort of got the impression that basically as a content producer, I was the low man on the totem pole. It's interesting. We had actually a pretty successful op-ed program, like getting op-eds in newspapers and things like that. But what I found is that the people who were actually doing the work of putting this all together, we were all the low men on the totem pole. And there were these middle managers above us. And, there wasn't that much money that was available to pay us. And I thought, well, this is taking a huge amount of my time away from the intellectual activist, away from the things that I want to be doing to provide for my own foundation, for my own publication outlet. And, it's taking way too much time and not getting paid quite enough to do it. But also there was this sense of ARI had this very much approach of wanting to centralize everything in the movement, that everything he needed to go through them. And if you were independent, you were outside of them. And especially if you were independent and then went against the consensus prevailing view that was sort of coming from the top down within the ARI circles, that was considered a problem. That you were off saying unapproved things, and they had that had to be controlled, or that had to be discouraged. And it came to a head really because I had a different approach to the war on terror and to the war in Iraq and that sort of thing than they had. And the differences, I mean, it seems, 20 years later, it seems almost irrelevant to talk about the differences in the details of what my view was. the more important thing was that it was like viewed as a major apostasy to have different views on foreign policy, which, you know, and the thing is, these are differences that would like hard to explain to anybody outside of objectivism. But they were things that were taken very seriously, that, oh, you can't say that. And there's a particular role that Leonard Pickoff had in this, and which is that when it tended to be this thing where when he adopted a view on something, he was much more active, of course, then.
Right.
Now he's mostly retired and only occasionally pops up in a video somewhere, but he's much more active then. And if he basically took a line on, here's what we should do about Iraq, here's what we should do about this, here's what we should do about that. If he took a line there and then you came out against him, that was very much frowned upon. And I think what happened is, and this might get us back into talking about the whole mechanics of the movement, but I think, you know, there's a line that Ayn Rand has, which I think is one of a big mistake that she made. It's an analogy that is not that bad on its own, but it's bad if you take it too literally. So in the essay For the New Intellectual, she has this line about how the philosopher is the commander in chief in an army. You know, the intellectuals are like an army, and the philosopher is the commander in chief. Right. Now, I kind of get where she's going with that analogy, but it's a bad analogy if you take it seriously, because then you think that, well, as the philosopher, I am commander in chief, and therefore I get to give orders, and everybody else is supposed to salute smartly and go follow those orders. And I think that
the orders never be questioned.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. That or it's more like the way it was used in practice is that more like, as a philosopher, I have access to this special extra level of knowledge that people who are mere journalists don't have, and therefore I am entitled to pronounce the final word upon this. And you know, that if you disagree, you are evading this higher philosophical knowledge or something like that. And I found that. And that's sort of started off the discomfort that I had with ARI. So one of the other reasons I left ARI was this sense that there was this sort of top-down view that there was a consensus formed from Leonard Pickoff that went down through the various people below him and then came to you, and you were supposed to follow it. And if you disagreed with that, you know, nobody was going to back you up and say, well, look, this is an alternative point of view we should consider, and we should and then we should have these kind of friendly debates like you and I have sometimes.
I think that was Kelly's line.
What's that?
Well, that's what he said when he got kicked out.
Yeah. You know,
everyone else had seen that.
So I was like a 20-year-old college kid when the David Kelly thing happened, and I was extremely online at the time. So on these discussion groups, you know, the pre-picture internet, and I actually took the opposite side. I took the ARI side there. But I think it was because I had this sort of rosy view from the outside of the way things worked in the movement. I'm like, how could you say that somebody as reasonable as Harry Binswanger is not, you know, is not open to open debate and discussion? And as we got along, I began to realize there was Harry was one of the better ones there, but I began to realize how much there really was to it. But the thing is, I've resisted all along of the idea of making it that the problem is one particular personality, right? The problem isn't one particular personality. It's the organization of the movement itself. And it's the way that was organized, especially the way it was not reorganized after Ayn Rand's death. And also the idea behind it, I think, was the wrong idea, was this idea from For the New Intellectual. The philosopher is the commander in chief, and the rest of the intellectuals are the lower officers in the army. And this sort of idea that philosophical ideas propagate top down. And I think that philosophical ideas propagating top down created this kind of centralized organization to the movement, where you had Leonard Pickoff for a while, and now you have Ankar Gate at Ayn Rand at ARI, who is he called their chief philosophy officer. The world has a scourge of chief X officer going on these days. But he's their chief philosophy officer, and this idea that you have to have a philosopher sitting up there pronouncing on everything and saying, here's what's the right line to take, and here's what's the wrong line to take, and that gets propagated down to everyone else. I think that's breaking up, because I think it could not be maintained, and some of this recent stuff that's happened is basically them giving up on trying to do that to some extent, because it can't be maintained over the long term. But I think that had a real impact on the movement, this sort of centralized top-down thing. And it had to do also, and it tied in with the whole history of the movement, the whole, because the movement was formed around a single person, around Ayn Rand, it had that highly centralized, there's one person, one philosopher in the middle, and all the ideas propagate outward from her. That was by necessity the way the movement was organized while she was alive, because it's a philosophy created by one person. But that had to change after she was no longer there to be the one person in the middle. And over time it had to change, and ARI always resisted, and the sort of ARI wing of the movement always resisted that change. They always wanted to keep it very centralized. And it's like, we're still going to have the collective from the Nathaniel Branden era. We're still going to have the collective. We're just going to change out the personnel in it. And instead of saying, no, we don't want to have that kind of organization anymore, we should have a new kind of organization and much more flourishing independent intellectuals, sort of all working together as they can on shared assumptions and shared projects.
Rob, do you
go ahead?
Rob,
I was going to get into the centralization stuff, but I know, William, you had a point about, you read something of Robert's years ago on the Kelly thing.
Yeah, I'll get to that. But first I want to ask, regarding the top-down versus bottom-up approaches, do you think that's related to the way ARI was set up initially? Their mission statement is essentially to spread Ayn Rand's ideas, but it seems like it's becoming something else, like to spread Leonard Pickoff's ideas or to spread Onkar Ghatel's ideas, interpreting Ayn Rand's ideas. So there's like this generational issue with intellectual movements, where originally, when you have the original thinker, Ayn Rand, she can say, this is my philosophy. But then when her students start taking over the movement, they're interpreters of her words. And so the ARI's mission statement, I think, needs to reflect that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about how weird the Objectivist movement is, because it's a weird movement, and it's, I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad, in like I'm criticizing somebody. It's not because somebody made a bad choice, though there were some bad choices. People did make bad choices. Mistakes were made, but it's not by anybody's choice that the movement became weird at its beginning. Because so let's back up a little bit. Usually, when you have an intellectual movement, a new idea, a new intellectual school of thought that comes up, you have three distinct groups of people, and these are all groups. So you usually have the philosophers or the theoreticians, the people developing the ideas. And then you have the popularizers, the people who then take these ideas from abstract, abstruse philosophers and turn it into art, or turn it into journalism, or turn it into commentary, turn it into political activism, etc. So they take the ideas and spread them out into the world in a more easily understandable form. So you have the intellectuals, you have the theorists, you have the popularizers, and then you've got the money guys, right? So that you've got the people who build organizations and raise money, or build a publication or a magazine or something like that, and provide that with funding. So somebody raising money for National Review so that the conservative movement can have this intellectual voice. So you have the theorists, you have the popularizers, you have the money guys. Well, and usually these are not just, these are all groups of people. Even the theorists are a group of people. You have like John Locke was the leading, most influential philosopher of the Enlightenment, but there were a bunch of other empiricist philosophers. There were a bunch of other natural rights theorists, right? And so all of them had an influence. All of them had slightly different approaches to how they would explain or argue for the ideas, but they were within the same general school of thought. Now, objectivism is so weird because we have one person who did all of these things. in a single individual, you had all these things. So Ayn Rand was overwhelmingly, I mean, there's a few contributions made here and there by Nathaniel Branden or Leonard Pickoff during her lifetime, but 99% of the philosophy, maybe 98% of the philosophy, was basically originated by her. So you had one person producing all the theory. Then, of course, for popularization, there's nothing that even gets close to Ayn Rand's own novels for popularizing her ideas. So all the popularizing of her philosophy goes through her work. And then there's the fact that she having the good fortune to live in the era of modern copyrights, as a popularizer of her own ideas. She was a best-selling novelist. She made, she had a small, she had a lucrative a stream of money from her books. And through her books, she also had access to an audience. So if the Nathaniel Branden Institute wanted to have a lecture series, they basically had to get her name and her involvement, and that would be what would bring the people in to go to their lectures. And so she became basically the theorist, the popularizer, and the money person, the source of income for anything going on full time in terms of in the movement. It was all built around one person, and so it created this extremely centralized, personalized thing. And it's also amplified by the fact that the philosophy of objectivism wasn't even complete, for a lot of that period of time. That she was still, up into the early 70s, she was still adding building blocks to.
Right.
Most of it was there by the early to mid 60s, but she was still adding elements and building blocks to her philosophy through the mid 70s. The philosophy became extremely centralized in one person to an extremely unusual extent. And you can see that in the early organization of the movement, and the Nathaniel Branden Institute was all really, it was called Nathaniel Branden Institute, but it was all really built around her, and access to her was the most important thing in the movement. And if her personal relationship with someone like Nathaniel Branden broke apart, then the movement broke apart, because it was all so centered around one person, as it had to be by the nature of, it's really because she had such an enormous intellectual and artistic achievement to be the originator of this whole philosophy and of these best-selling novels. So it was a good thing that she was able to achieve so much, but at the same time, it made the movement very centralized and very centered around her. And the big thing that had to happen after she died was she was no longer there. You couldn't have a single arbiter, and it's actually much healthier organization for a movement to have it be built more on the existing model of a group of independent intellectuals. And that's what she herself anticipated in some of the things she wrote about the movement, saying this should be, a group of independent intellectuals all moving in the same direction, about, working from similar premises, and not around one person anymore. But that's not what we did, because, the thing is, the movement had been built that way, that highly centralized way. It had been built that way for, 1958 to 1983. It was like 25 years. And, one of the things you learn, I've learned as my experience over the years, is organizations, institutions, things that are built up on a certain model tend not to want to change. And specifically, I think what happened is Leonard Pickoff then said, I'm Ayn Rand's intellectual heir. And what that meant in practice was that he would now serve the function that she had served, as being the one central person around which everything was built. And I saw that happen. I think what William was talking about, because I think we both saw the same thing happen around ARI, especially around the early 2000s. And I had some other students who were in their graduate courses at the time talk about this, about how it became, the courses and the classes they were teaching became less about teaching Ayn Rand and more about teaching Leonard Pickoff. So that his systemization of objectivism in his book, we all call it OPAR, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, that the acronym is OPAR. His systematization of her philosophy at OPAR became the source. And there was this sort of buildup that was done, this sort of building up Leonard Pickoff as a personality, as I don't want to say cult of personality, but it kind of, you had some overtones there. There were some things that were sort of hagiographic kind of things that were done about him for a brief while in that sort of late 90s, early 2000s thing. And he had a radio show, and there was this attempt to sort of like, let's reform the movement around one single central person. Mm-hmm. And that was Leonard Pickoff. And it created a problem, though, in that when you do that, I'm going to back up a little bit too, because this came into some of the stuff I wrote during the David Kelly thing when it first came out. Now, I don't want anybody to take too seriously anything I wrote when I was a 20-year-old college kid, but one of the reasons why I sort of took the ARI side against David Kelly at the time, and why I kind of understand the 1980s objectivism thing of we're going to centralize this, we're going to have control, is that there were a lot of people going out there trying to glom on to Ayn Rand's ideas and kind of bastardize them or muddle them. And so there was this sense that new things being added were not good new things. They were bad. They were detractions. They were subtractions from her philosophy. So there was a suspicion that, you know, a lot of the people trying to go add to or you know, attach themselves to the philosophy of these sort of especially a lot of libertarians at the time, were not really, they were there to sort of to water down the philosophy or to detract from it rather than to add to it. But the thing is, over time, there's going to be independent people who have things to add to it. And also there's going to be a lot of difference in terms of how you think, you know, what do you think this implies for foreign policy, or for who you should vote for, or for or even for, you know, what is the state of the world, and what should our priorities be? And there's going to be lots of realm for new ideas, because, you know, the knowledge does not stand still, right? There's going to be Ayn Rand was only one person. The amount she created was so astonishing philosophically and intellectually. The amount of what she created was so astonishing, but that you can't say, well, therefore she should have then gone on to create everything. There has to be new ideas that are going to be added, and refinements to her ideas, corrections, I think a few here and there, a few small places, and new additions and expansion of that to other places. And I think what happened was, because you still had that centralized model, and that not just the centralized model, but also the sort of protective crouch of, we have to protect her philosophy from being bastardized by all these people who want to do bad things with it, that it became very much, there was Leonard Pickoff and a few people authorized by him who were basically made the arbiters of the philosophy. And they were, in fact, despite all this talk about open versus closed objectivism, they were in fact allowed to add to it. You know, so in the 2000s, Leonard Pickoff added some stuff on philosophy of history. He added some stuff on induction, and so they were allowed to add to it, but nobody else was allowed to do anything, and nobody else was allowed to disagree with that or criticize it too much. And so there became this sort of, but that centralization increasingly became a problem. And that was sort of, I was one of the first people to sort of rebel. I was one of the people to rebel against that. I won't say I was the first, but I was one of the people to rebel against that. And I sort of I left ARI very deliberately in the early 2000s because of the sense that, you know, if that they're not going to like my disagreeing, and I didn't want to be dependent on them and have to worry about whether they liked me or disagreed with me or not. So I wanted to create my own independent platform to do things.
And so Scott mentioned that I actually read your article, Notes on a Question of Sanction. And you just said not to take that seriously, or too seriously.
Seriously.
Yeah.
William based his life on it. No, I'm kidding.
So basically I became an objectivist in the mid 90s, the late 90s. And I was, you know, just learning about the whole schism with David Kelly. And so I read Fact and Value. Mm-hmm. And then I was having trouble grasping the issues. And so I came upon your article. And for some reason, that seemed like the clearest thing to me. Like, you laid it all out and it seemed very reasonable. And I liked your analytical approach. Like, you took everything apart and looked at all the little statements and everything. And so that had a profound impact on me. And that's kind of why I chose the ARI side. I have since come to disagree with some things in there and have reevaluated my opinion of David Kelly. So I'm wondering, do you have any regrets, or have you reevaluated your opinion as well?
Well, yeah. Okay. So I almost feel like I should apologize to you for having a profound impact that way. Although I'm not disavowing everything I said in there. I actually thought I did a good job with it, but in some respects. But I have since reevaluated some of that. Now, you've probably read that thing more recently than I have, because I wrote it in 1989 or 1990 during the height of the David Kelly, that controversy.
Well, I've read it several times, and I just reread it for this interview. So there's a lot in there, and I'm wondering, you do get into the honesty issue, because one of my problems with the ARI side is that they're calling David Kelly dishonest. And I have come to disagree with that. I think he's honest. I think he has an honest opinion. And I'm wondering what your take is now.
Okay, so there are two aspects of it. One is what had an impact on me at the time. Like I said, it's been probably 25 years since I've actually revisited that. So I'm going from my memory of what I wrote at the time. But one of the things that I know that did impact me was that I had this personal relationship with a lot of the people involved. A lot of the people who are well known in ARI circles. And so I bristled at the interpretation of them as being dogmatic or being intolerant, et cetera. And I think part of it is that, and I noticed this in the recent thing, that this recent letter that ARI put out, that if you actually read what they say about here's how we do things, they disavow any idea of, oh, we're not part of the centralized, we're not the center of the movement. We don't consider ourselves the arbiters of what is objectivist and who isn't objectivist. And if you sort of take what they advertise themselves as being, it all sounds incredibly reasonable. And that was very much the view I got from the outside. And you don't realize the extent to which they don't actually live by that. They don't actually follow that. I think that's great that they're sort of giving ground on the theory in this recent thing. But at the same time, in this recent letter, they give ground to the theory, but then they say, oh, but all the actual schisms we had were actually totally correct. So they give ground on the theory, but in the practice, they want to, cling tightly to every schism that we've had, every person we've kicked out or put at arm's length really deserved it.
Even when they admit to making a mistake, like in the McCaskey schism, they still seem to hold to them being on the right side of things.
Well, in the McCaskey thing, the only mistake they admit to is that we gave people too much information about what was going on.
Right? Yeah, they released the email.
Yeah, we released this email, and we should have kept you completely in the dark because, okay, let's talk about this recent email for a second, which is the basic theme of it is that any schism or disagreement that involves anything that's private, a private business arrangement or private dealings between people, anything that involves something that's a private personal relationship, outsiders are unable to judge. Now, I'm going to let's put that aside as to whether that's really true. But then what they do is they then say, therefore, having established that, they create a history in which every single schism that's happened has involved some kind of private disagreement or private relationships, and therefore conveniently you as an outsider are completely unable to judge it.
That's right.
The sort of self-serving or the motivated reasoning behind that I think is pretty obvious. They
can I jump in real quick, because I have an opinion about that. I think that what's actually happening here is they're waging some campaign against eyewitness testimony, as if if you weren't in the room when these things were being said and the argument was being made, then you can't have an opinion about it because you don't know, you weren't the eyewitness to that statement.
But I'm a big fan though of Tui's thing. Don't bother to examine a folly, ask what it accomplishes. And what this accomplishes is it means you as an outsider cannot possibly judge anything that we ARI does. Now they fudge the facts tremendously to do this. And in my case, they sort of imply there was some sort of business disagreement. The only thing I can think of that even remotely qualifies that is something that happened afterwards, after I'd already sort of left and gotten into, had open ideological disagreements with the ARI wing and with Leonard Pickoff. Only after that was there like one thing that there was some disagreement about, which they never pursued. So, but again, it's the idea of, so it had nothing to do with why I left working with ARI, nothing to do with why I was sort of considered to be persona non grata for a long time. But they have to put it in there because then it makes it a private discussion, a private disagreement, and therefore it's outside the realm of evaluation.
No, that's an interesting take. It is.
Yeah.
Well, I really like the piece you wrote, Schismatology, and its message, and that's at tracinskiletter.substack.com. But within that, I'm not quite sure that ARI would accept that they've conceded as much as you say. One thing you say in the piece, that I suppose making the topics of schisms a matter of discussion, which implies that it's also a matter for debate, is progress. But I mean, they're really kind of bringing schisms up as a vehicle for saying their schisms are all right and normal, with the implication that we shouldn't be asking too many questions about it anyway.
Yeah, and it's really an attempt to quell young students and donors asking too many questions about this. That's what it's really all about. Well, like I said, this is their thing, is that they to seem reasonable on the surface, and then to do something completely different behind the scenes is kind of typical of some of the people involved here. And that's one of the other reasons I left ARI was my judgment of some of the people I was dealing with, that, you would talk to them and it would all sound very reasonable, and it was, they would acknowledge the points you had to make, and they would seem like they're really thinking about it and really understood what you had to say. And then they go about and do something that, really was the product of whatever pressures were dictated by the internal office politics of the movement. So it was the sense of, people seeming reasonable on the outside, but actually acting according to this very intense office politics that went on. A lot of what goes on behind the scenes in the movement, it reminds me of the old saying about how in academia they say the reason why the office politics in academia is so vicious is because the stakes are so small. Because it is true that this is a small movement. There is a relatively small amount of money and full-time jobs available. If you want to be, get up every day and be writing and teaching about ideas, and not having to go sell insurance and do this on the side. No offense to people who sell insurance. That's always my go-to example for the one thing I never want to do in life.
Noble work.
So it's my like placeholder for the uninteresting day job, right? So if you don't have to have a day job, if you want to be able to do this, there's a limited amount of of number of jobs and positions that are available, and so because of that, if ARI being the biggest, one with the most money flowing through it, because it has that brand name, the Ayn Rand Institute, that it becomes this prize to be fought over. And so part of what goes on behind the scenes is you have, this faction wants control over that prize of, we have the Ayn Rand name and the Ayn Rand Institute and the money that flows, the reputation and the money that flows through that. And so oftentimes, there's whatever the argument is actually nominally about, whether it's foreign policy or whatever, or Donald Trump or whatever else, behind the scenes, there's probably also a little other aspect of, it's also about, somebody within my faction who has a minor disagreement, that's okay, we can discuss that. Somebody outside my faction who has a minor disagreement, he's a heretic, let's purge him. So there tends to be this sort of like there's a bit of a cliquishness that has gone on. But I think that all comes out of that top-down
centralization.
Like I said, it's all the collective, this group of young intellectuals who were gathered around Ayn Rand back in the Nathaniel Branden days. It's all that same organization, just repeated over and over again, but with the personnel changing as the years go by. But that leads, so we were talking about my thing that I wrote back in the day about the David Kelly thing. So the first thing I would say is that I've changed my view on is, I had an overly rosy view and an overly positive view of some of the people who were involved and didn't know some of the office politics that were going on behind the scenes. And you had to experience it yourself before you started to realize what was actually going on. The second thing is the issue of open versus closed objectivism. So this is something I was convinced by some of the arguments in favor of closed objectivism. The idea that objectivism is just what Ayn Rand said, that the philosophy is complete, it's closed, there's nothing more to be added to it, and maybe just a few details, and therefore that we shouldn't consider it to be open to do additions and changes. And like I said, a lot of that also came from the fact that when I wrote that, I was extremely online, as we would say today. I was spending a lot of time, more time than I should have, less time than I should have studying, and more time than I should have on the objectivist discussion groups on the internet. And there were crazy people out there who wanted to, add all sorts of weird and bizarre things to the philosophy. So that sort of sense of this philosophy needs to be protected from new ideas. I kind of grasp where that came from, because that was very much part of the online culture of the objectivist movement at the time.
And that was training that Rand herself drilled into Pickoff in her later years.
I think to some extent, yeah, because she was the way I put it is she's the kind of author who didn't like fan fiction. That she had a very authorial uh, attitude to her philosophy. Right, this is a proprietary authorial thing. The way that, and you can understand the way a novelist would look at her characters. Can you imagine what she would have thought of somebody creating fan fiction stories where it's like, well, here's a story. We're going to take Hank Rearden and Dagny Taggart. I'm going to write my own story with these characters. She would have thought that was terrible because, of course, this is her personal vision. And how can you bastardize my personal vision? And she had that attitude a bit towards her philosophy. And I kind of understand it, too, because, like I said, there were crazy people out there. There were people who were, a lot of the additions that people wanted to add to her to create for her philosophy were not additions, they were detractions. So I understand the sort of motive for that. This philosophy needs to be protected from being bastardized, which was behind a lot of this. But I think that what ultimately convinced me about that was a couple of things. First of all, was seeing the fact that what the closed objectivism meant in practice was Leonard Pickoff gets to add new ideas to objectivism. And he said since then, like a whole part of his chapter on objectivity in OPAR was new stuff that he developed. And it's good stuff. It's worth adding, but it was added by him. It was added by somebody other than Ayn Rand. It was developed after her death. It was added by him and not approved by her. It's his own addition to the philosophy. Or he then added ideas about induction. He added ideas about philosophy of history.
Right.
So in practice, it came to mean that closed objectivism means it's closed for everybody else, but it's open for this one person. And you can't do that. But more to the point, I think what really sort of pushed it for me was in the early 2000s, I started to come up with my own new ideas that I thought were corrections, especially corrections of this idea of, the philosopher as commander-in-chief giving orders, this sort of top-down view of the role of philosophy. I came up with new ideas of my own that I thought were valid things to contribute to the philosophy and put them out there. And you just couldn't do that. And so I began to realize that knowledge is not going to stand still. Ayn Rand has been, it's coming up on 40, is it 40 years since her death coming up?
It's just been 40 years in this past March.
Oh, I thought it was 83. It must have been 82. Okay. It's odd because I heard some people online, a couple of articles were published, the 40th anniversary of Ayn Rand's death. I'm like, this is not an anniversary Objectivists celebrate. We celebrate Ayn Rand's birthday. We celebrate Ayn Rand's birthday. We celebrate, Atlas Shrugged Day, September 2nd, because that's the repeated date that keeps showing up in Atlas Shrugged.
Right.
We don't celebrate the anniversary of her death, but some articles came out. So yeah, it's been 40 years since she's not been here. And the idea that there's going to be nothing new to add to philosophy in 40 years, when you think about it, it's just implausible, right? There's no, knowledge is open-ended, right? There are going to be new discoveries and new creations, new refinements, and it's detracting nothing from the enormity of her achievement or the size of her achievement to say that there's still going to be new stuff that's going to have to be added. And what really convinced me about that is if objectivism means only what Ayn Rand wrote, then what you're doing is you're creating a program in which objectivism is eventually going to disappear because there are going to be new additions to knowledge and people are going to want to use those new additions. And if you say you can't call any of that objectivism, then eventually people are going to have to come up with a new name for a school of thought that is based on Ayn Rand's ideas, but has these additions and start using that. And they'd have to drop objectivism altogether. So knowledge is not going to stand still. People are going to add things to it, and as Pickoff has done, and as some of us think we've done, that we've added something useful. And so it's you're going to have this way of accommodating new ideas that are aftermarket add-ons to her philosophy. And so I think that's, you can do it in a very, I think we have to start viewing objectivism as a school of thought and not as one single philosophy. And Absolutely. Then there are all sorts of ways in plain English to differentiate this. So I'm taking some of my ideas of philosophy of history, some of the things that sort of signal my break with the orthodox wing of the movement that I first published in 2006, 2007. I'm putting them together into a book right now that's going to come out hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And
Good. I remember them alluding to that in the Schisms piece.
yeah. So it's article. The book's called "What Went Right," which is basically my attempt to account for how do you explain all the progress in the world, because there's also very heavily pessimistic mood that pervaded the objectivist movement, especially back then. And so, but it's my attempt to, and the subtitle is going to be An Objectivist Theory of History. So this is an objectivist theory, not the objectivist theory. So there's lots of plain English way. We can talk about Ayn Rand's philosophy. We can talk about the objectivist philosophy. We could talk about an objectivist theory. So it's like a theory that is based on objectivism, influenced by objectivism, which I believe is consistent with objectivism, but which is a theory, not the theory. So there's lots of plain English ways we can deal with this, but we're going to have to. And I think a lot of what you're seeing right now with the discussion about schisms is people sort of adjusting to the actual reality that is inevitable. That, Ayn Rand has been gone for 40 years. There's the idea that there's going to be one single person with authority to be the arbiter of the movement. Ayn Rand Institute has formally given up on that because practically they can't enforce it. Practically, that's not going to last.
You're right. I mean, you say that, but it's one of the things you say, a concession they make is that it's normal for a movement to have leaders that disagree vehemently about, and that, at TAS, you quote them saying it's normal that it should be treated as such. But, wouldn't they just say that, well, it's normal except in these cases we mentioned, like Tracinski, Kelly, Biddle, or Barney, those all just happen to have moral failings we had to step away from.
Well, and that's the whole purpose of the sort of everything is private kind of approach, which is that in theory, ideological disagreements and even some professional disagreements should be something that we can accommodate. But in practice, this person did something totally wrong and we're completely justified in never speaking to them again. So again, like I said, they're clinging like hell to the details. And if you keep in mind that, again, behind a lot of what's done ideologically in public, behind it, there is an element of cliquishness and a faction. So if you look at it that way, that the idea of maintaining that, all of our factional disputes that we've had are completely justified, that's the ground they really want to protect. And that's the ground they are protecting in this. Whereas giving way on the theory, it's like they're fine giving away on the theory, so long as in practice they can protect this ground of our favorite factional disputes are totally valid. Now, one of the things I want to say about this is that I left ARI. I didn't get kicked out from ARI. I stopped working for them. And so my point here isn't that, and I think the problem I have with sort of some of the things that Craig Biddle and especially Carl Barney have been saying, is I still get the feeling they're like, we should be entitled to be working with ARI. The ARI should take Craig Biddle back into the fold. It should bring people back into the fold, and that's the thing they're petitioning for. That's not what I want. I think what I want is that we should become the more normal, natural way of organizing a movement where there's ARI here and they can do what they like. And then there's Carl Barney over here who has, lots of money of his own that he can put into something. And he does something with Carl and Craig can do something. And then Rob Tracinski can go do something over here, and the Atlas Society can do something over there. And, there'll be some overlap and cooperation between these groups, but it should become more normal and natural that for the intellectuals working here and for the donors, which I think is the thing, is that, if you're a donor, you shouldn't just, there's a problem that happens in the nonprofit world, which is when you have somebody who has a big brand name, if you're a donor and you've made money in real estate, you don't know philosophy, you don't know all the details of the different disputes, and you probably don't care, and that's fine. You don't have to care. But then when you're deciding who should I give money to, the thing that people tend to do is, well, we'll go with the big brand name. And this has become a problem, not just, not even in the intellectual world, but in the nonprofit world in general. The Red Cross is notorious for this, that people give to it because it's the Red Cross. It's the big brand name that you can't question, but it's notorious for the fact that its management is extremely, they pay a lot of money. A lot of the money you give to the Red Cross goes to pay its managers to raise money for the Red Cross. Right. And very little of it actually goes being used to help people. So
that's funny you say that, because my dad hates the Red Cross, because my mom went to donate blood once and they didn't check on her, and she almost died because they took too much blood.
Yeah. Well, like I said, these things become the big brand name and you can't question it. And then and people give money just because, well, it's the brand name. And I think Objectivists have something the same problem, that you've got people come in and say, I want to give something. I'm excited about these ideas. I want to give something to promote this. I'll give to the name I recognize, the Ayn Rand Institute. That's got the brand name. And I think we have to have among the donors a little more, there's been a revolution in among donors in the nonprofit world in general, of saying, you actually have to do your research. You can't just give money. If you want to, you actually have to understand who you're giving it to and who's going to use it more effectively. And that it's in some ways it's worse to give money without looking at that first. So I'd like to see the donors have a more of a wider perspective of, okay, I'm going to give some money maybe to the ARI for some things I like that they're doing, but let's look see who else out there is doing things that are valuable. And I have some of my own subscribers who have modestly given certain amounts of money to support things that I'm doing, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think that needs to be more of the attitude that we have in terms of the organization, the movement, for the rank and file members, for the average person who's interested in this, for the donors, for the young intellectuals, to have more of it be natural, that there's this multiplicity of organizations that each one has something to offer, and regarding that as natural, and not as being as centralized. So, and I think it comes from the fact that this I think the open versus closed philosophy, that argument has basically been lost. That and it had to be lost, because there are going to be people of all different persuasions offering new ideas that are valuable. And so I think that there's sort of, ARI is still sort of fighting a rearguard action against the fact that the reality is that more independent intellectuals are coming up and doing the sort of thing I do, because now Substack is there. And like I said, I started a Substack in 2004, when you had to go through a lot of trouble to cobble together a system of, how do I get paid by my subscribers? How do I send things out to them? It was a lot of work. Now you can anybody can start a Substack. It's too darn easy, because you got all these competitors coming up now. And I wanted my barriers to entry to be there just a little bit. But you have much more, it becoming a reality that we have a movement of independent intellectuals, much more a reality that there are multiple sources of funding, much more a reality that there are people adding new ideas that people who are interested in objectivism are going to want to use and incorporate into the philosophy. So I think that basically time heals all wounds intellectually, and it's pushing the movement in a certain direction just by the natural logic of events.
Well, that's I hope donors do get more thoughtful, especially in the objectivist movement. Another concession you say they make is them saying other objectivists, conceding there can be other non-ARI objectivists, but don't they just mean other ARI approved groups, be it like Ayn Rand Center UK or Alex Epstein's group, or even the Yaron Brook show?
Yeah. Well, no, I think they talk about other objectivists. They're talking about people who've criticized them and people who've disagreed with them. So I don't know if they intended to make that concession. I mean, it could have been this. They didn't think the implications of that, or maybe they meant donors and young intellectuals who are affiliated with ARI who have asked questions about this. But I think that use of the phrase "other objectivists," it's an acknowledgement that, okay, this movement is broadening out. So. I think that's sort of an implicit acknowledgement that, like I said, the reality of the movement is becoming such that there are enough different people doing different things.
Okay, so I just wanted to point out one thing that you said in the article about ARI claiming they're not going to rebut the arguments against them, but then they go on to say they're going to clarify why their detractors are non-objective. Yeah. So you're kind of pointing out that they want their cake and eat it too. Yeah. I thought that's a great analytical point, which is part of why I liked your original article on Kelly, because you have this great way of this powerful way of presenting your points. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you analyze these articles and come up with these, insightful points about how ARI is contradicting themselves.
Well, I mean, that just comes from, frankly, it's from experience of having it's something that I think is way better than the thing I wrote about David Kelly's thing a long time ago, is that it was sort of, it had, I think there was some good analysis in there, and there's some things I disagree with in what David Kelly was writing at the time. I like David personally, and always have, and I think I've come over to his side more on the open versus closed objectivism, but there were some aspects of what he's argued then and since that I don't agree with. But a lot of this, I think what I'm able to say about the objectivist movement now is improved by the fact of having 30 years of experience. Maybe no, it's 35 now. Basically, since that first time I read Atlas Shrugged, it's been 35 years now. Having all these years of experience and knowing, seeing all these things as they go by. I mean, age has its advantages, which is you get a lot of life experience and you develop a more, it's easier to look behind the facades of things to see what's actually going on. Because like I said, you mentioned that ARI they have a tendency to sort of have this, we are above everything and we're working on this lofty intellectual plane sort of attitude that they convey, while at the same time then, and here now we're going to get deep down into the nitty gritty. I mean, there's a whole last section of that letter I couldn't even read because it's all this he said, she said between them and Craig Biddle. And why would I care, right? It's the whole letter sort of had this feeling of like, this is written for an audience of 40 people, who are all movement insiders.
I kind of take a somewhat opposite view of that, because I think the details matter, because I think that's how you reach an inductive opinion about something. Yeah. You got to look at the details of the schisms in order to understand them. And that's one of my criticisms of ARI's article, is that they don't look at the details enough, in my opinion.
They look at them very selectively. You get their side, you get very much their side of the story.
But they don't even get to the essential ones. It's because Barney's problem was that he's accusing ARI of breaking an oral contract they had. Yeah. And they didn't even touch that in the article.
Oh yeah, and like I said, with the brief little thing they say about me, they skip over what were actually the big issues. I mean, the big issue that the thing that sort of made me break with the movement primarily was this. Scott mentioned it. I don't know if it was before we were recording or not, but Scott mentioned this thing that happened in 2006, where Leonard Pickoff came out and said, basically, if you don't vote Democrat in the midterm congressional elections, if you don't vote to make Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House, then you're not really an objectivist. You don't really understand the philosophy, and you're basically disqualified. And of course, here I am writing about politics. I completely disagreed with that. I thought that was exactly the wrong thing to do in that election.
He said something similar in 2004, the presidential election.
Yes, that was. But he said something similar, but not as completely like you aren't even an objectivist unless you do this, right? But yeah, he was anti-Bush in the 2004 election, and I sort of gave a half-hearted endorsement of Bush. I never give a full-throated endorsement of a politician, because they're politicians, right? Right. They're always going to disappoint you in some way, but you're always choosing the lesser of two evils, and sometimes it's less. Sometimes it's a lot lesser than other times. But it was really in 2006 where he came out and basically declared, you are not an objectivist if you don't vote for Democrats, which was this, not just you don't vote for the Republican, but you actually positively, actively go out there and vote for Democrats. And the way he put it, the way he said that, basically, it was very much in the spirit of the philosopher is the commander in chief giving the orders, and you have to salute smartly and follow them. And I came out very openly and very, I think, persuasively disagreeing with that. I mean, I quoted some of his own. What ticked some people off is I actually ended my thing by quoting something he himself had said back in the early 90s about an election recommendation.
Now you're in trouble.
Yeah, and basically showed that he was completely reversing what he had said before, and what he had said before was correct, which is a philosophy does not endorse candidates. A philosophy is a view of the world that doesn't dictate something is narrow and concrete, doesn't directly dictate something is narrow and concrete as how you would vote. So basically, he had said something correct about this years earlier, and I quoted that back. And I think it was because what got me into a lot of trouble is because it was persuasive, because it was a good, sharp, effective answer. And that sort of set people off, because they're not used. We talked about this earlier. They're not used to getting, there's a bit of a bubble effect, right? That they've because of the centralization of the movement, because of the way everything's sort of built around this circle of people around, that they're not used to getting that kind of effective pushback and disagreement from within the movement once an idea has been adopted and become the consensus and is being propagated down. So I think that they didn't like it because they're not used to having effective opposition and view that as a threat. And so it was I got a very unpleasant response to that. And that was sort of what broke it open. Now then, of course, I came out with new ideas. Basically by 2006, what had happened is partly because of that election thing and partly because of what I'd done with my building up my newsletter and all that sort of thing. I had that independence. So I said, well, look, I've got new ideas on the philosophy of history. I'm just going to go publish them, because what are they going to do to me? There's nothing nobody can do anything to stop me. And that sort of ramped it up that, oh, he's now an apostate. He's now, against objectivism because I've proposed some new ideas in this narrow field. Like I said, I argue that my ideas are consistent with objectivism. I think I'm correcting some bad implications in some things that Ayn Rand wrote. I'm correcting some bad implications in things that people have written subsequently. But I think my views are consistent with objectivism, and I think the way we should leave it as is people decide for themselves as to whether they think I've got a valid new idea or if I've gone on the wrong track. But it created this excuse to say, see, this guy who came out against us on this political views, oh, now we can completely discount him because he's not, he's validated Leonard Pickoff's view that he's not really an objectivist because he has minor disagreements on the philosophy of history. And the disagreements in the philosophy of history really did center around the same sort of top-down view of the impact of ideas. It was that, their view was that basically new ideas get adopted by philosophers in the ivory tower first, and then all progress in society emanates down from there. When I pointed to numerous examples in contemporary world from my perspective as a journalist, but also from history and of cases in which it actually went the other way. The ancient Greeks. My big examples, one of the big examples was the ancient Greeks, where if you look at the timeline of ancient Greece, there's this huge amount of stuff done in science and art and the development of the ancient Greek tragedy, all in history and the first development of history as a scientific discipline, all this stuff that's happening before you even get to anything like Aristotle, right? So it's more the case that Aristotle is coming along and benefiting from all the progress made elsewhere, and then incorporating that into and using that as the basis for his philosophy, rather than all progress coming from the philosophers on down. So that's sort of the encapsulated
distinction.
It's the encapsulated version of my case in the book. But that became something considered, I think it's a very sensible view. It complements a lot of what's been said in objectivism, but it became the sort of thing was viewed as like, oh, he's departed from or disagrees with objectivism. And it was my attempt to make a contribution to improving the philosophy, adding new knowledge and correcting, I think, a few wrong implications in some previous things. So, like I said, the movement, I think, is going to have to be, this is inevitably going to happen. The movement's going to have to be open to it. I think it's becoming more open to it. And I think that this is just attempts to sort of cope with that and to deal with that environment that's already happening.
Do you think that the top-down view is correct for false philosophies? Because
you go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Because they're just fantasies, and so if someone like dreams up some crazy philosophy, then it has to come top down. But
yeah,
if
no way to
it's
get it inductively,
but if it's inductively arrived at, then you're going to have, like you say, scientists and engineers and everything figuring things out just by working with reality, and then the philosophers see what works and they develop the principles from that.
Yeah, exactly. For example, Ayn Rand herself acknowledged you couldn't have had Atlas Shrugged and her philosophy on capitalism. You couldn't have had that without the Industrial Revolution to provide the example, the inductive base for the conclusion about the role of the mind and the achievements possible to capitalism. So right. You have to, in an inductive philosophy, you actually have to have the scientific knowledge and other forms of knowledge. You have to have them arrive first, so that you then have an inductive base that the philosopher can work from. But with it, I do think there's a case, this is part of my book, that I actually just proofread that section of it as I'm trying to get it ready for publication. And I think to a large extent, you actually have to have a bad philosophy has to come from the top down, because it can't be arrived at inductively. So you have to have the philosophers banging away at this message. Now, what the philosophers do, though, is that's how you get also the corruption of certain fields of knowledge. That, if you have a philosophy that says, well, you can't really know reality, all you can know is your perception of reality, you then have to have somebody develop the Copenhagen interpretation in physics, that would tell you, yes, this is actually true of physics. I mean, there was a huge, I think it's less so now, but it's a huge fad when I was young in the 80s. There's a book called The Tao of Physics, and a lot of books similar to that, where they basically said, modern physics and quantum theory proves that that ancient Buddhist or mystical Eastern philosophy is actually true. And there was a huge genre of that came out of the 70s and 80s. And
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yes, I read that too. Yes, yeah, that was how I became a teenage Kantian. That was one of the things, because it's a totally Kantian perspective in that book, and I read that and it had an impact, and I absorbed those ideas without knowing where they came from. But there was this attempt to then take that not just in philosophy, to push it into physics and push it into psychology. And so Freudianism is developed to validate a certain view that's consistent with a certain philosophical view. So that's how you have it, sort of the bad ideas pushed down into the various fields. And the way I think of it is that if you grow up, if in studying, in acquiring knowledge and going to school, you absorb all these sort of you go to physics class, you learn physics and are told that, oh, this shows everything's just subjective and our perception of the world doesn't match reality. And if you go to psychology and you're told that, well, what's in your conscious mind isn't the real reality, it's just a gloss put over the raw urges of the unconscious mind, the id. And you learn that sort of thing in a whole bunch of different fields. In economics, you get Marxism or some variant of it. Then what will happen is that the bad philosophy will seem like it makes sense. It's coherent with all the rest of your knowledge. Whereas, by contrast, if and I think that there's some progress has been made in some of these, like if you go to psychology and you get cognitive behavioral therapy and you're told, well, it's your thinking that influences your emotions. And if you want to change your emotional reactions, you should change your thinking. This is a major field now. It is actually becoming, I think, the consensus in psychiatry. If you learn that, then you hear Ayn Rand say something about reason and the emotion, you're going to say, yes, of course. It's going to seem natural and to make sense to you. So I think, as it's this reciprocal relationship that the sciences especially have with philosophy, that the things you learn in the one place reinforces the knowledge you get in the other place, and they influence each other back and forth.
That's I wanted to bring up my favorite part of the piece, where you talk about how you're on kind of a trial run with the relationship with the Atlas Society, and you're delighted that they followed some of the advice that you gave them, and then you say, which is weird, right?
You're freaking out, man.
I like your self-effacing, and I mean, I can relate to it too. I wonder how much is it the open close thing, that they almost can't appreciate new ideas that didn't come from Rand herself?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's people don't take my advice about, I mean, outside of Objectivism, nobody takes my advice about politics either. I have a long running track record where the minute I endorse a candidate, he craters in the polls. It's like, it's consistent, and it's consistent, and it's pretty immediate. It's like, oh, I think this candidate looks really good. And then like 2 weeks later, crash. All
right. Maybe we could use you on Predict It.
I think I have a good opposite to predict. It has to do maybe with the fact that what I look for in a candidate is different from what the voters are looking for. No, it's hard to get people to take your advice in the best of situations. I mean, this is the lament of the intellectual. It's my job to deal with ideas. Then it's hard to get anybody to listen to you once you have the ideas. But I think the movement has a tendency that you have different organizations, and they're very closed off to outside ideas. So I like the fact that I gave them advice on how to deal with this and they actually listened to it. And my advice was take the concessions on principle and focus on that. And don't get dragged down to into the mud of he said, she said on all the details of the controversies. And, you know, I get William's point that is important when you're actually involved in judging the people. But at the same time, I think, you know, keep the eyes on the prize of the wider principle that of how the movement should be organized. Because I think that makes a big difference. And having those sort of concessions down on paper, having it down on paper that there's no one central organization that is the arbiter of who's an objectivist and who's not. That's an important thing to have down, you know, in writing and officially, and it helps out, materially helps out those of us who are independent intellectuals.
But what they're saying,
yeah,
aren't they saying though that they're not the leader of an organized movement? Do you think that they're trying to split hairs there?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's some of that. I mean, I wrote a piece a while back, you may have seen, called I paraphrased Will Rogers. I said, I'm not a member of any organized intellectual movement. I'm an objectivist. He had said that about us. I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think they're sort of reluctantly acknowledging the reality of it becoming a more diverse and more independent movement. But you didn't mention the thing that was my favorite part of what I wrote about it, which is they had mentioned, as you know, saying that intellectual disagreement is normal. They said, well, what about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson? Now, aside from the fact that, you know, as a committed Jeffersonian, I have to point out John Adams actually was in the wrong in that dispute, in the way he dealt with the 1800 election and the Alien and Sedition Acts, et cetera. But the thing that really jumped out at me about that example they chose is that Adams and Jefferson had this bitter disagreement, but they patched it up, and they patched it up within 10 years. I've actually found, and I linked to it in there, a delightful little article talking about they had a mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, one of the other, you know, chief leaders of the revolution, and he had a dream about Jefferson and about in 1809. He had a dream in which Jefferson and Adams had begun communicating and exchanging letters again. And he wrote this off to Adams saying, I had this dream. It would be great if that happened. And he got Adams to make the first concession of saying, yes, I would kind of like that to happen. And it took about 3 years of sort of going back and forth before Adams finally, you know, he's a very proud man, before Adams finally made the concession of sending a note to Jefferson. And then Jefferson said, oh, I'm so glad to hear from you. And this exchange, you know, begins again. This famous exchange of letters begins again. But I thought how lightning fast that is as a reconciliation by the standards of the Objectivist movement. I mean, we're still arguing over stuff that happened 30 years ago. I can't, you know, the number of, I can't really think of great examples of an Adams Jefferson example happening in our movement. And I think that's what we need a little bit more of, is somebody saying sending a letter saying, you know, hey, we had disagreements, but it's happened here and there. I've had a few things like that happen, but more of people saying, look, we had some disagreements, but let's resume this back and forth. And Adams once said to Jefferson, we shouldn't die before we have understood one another. And I think we have that. So I thought Adams Jefferson example, I thought, is something that is actually so much richer and more interesting when you think about what actually happened in that.
Yeah, that's not a good example of just blowing someone off forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great, that background. And I kind of want to relate that a little bit back to politics in our last few minutes, just to say that, you know, I mean, like I said, I came in there skeptical to our clubhouse sessions, and I still may have been holding back out of deference to Jag and David. And you know, I mean, I'm glad that I did, because you're not, you know, a Democrat or, you know, some, and I mean, that's obvious. I mean, if only from your war comments, but it just, you know, it's like with Jonah Goldberg. We alluded to Star Trek earlier. I mean, I used to love Jonah Goldberg and his Star Trek references, but now because of politics, I feel like, you know, we can't even do that. And I want us all to get past, you know, I mean, I think everyone's almost over Trump anyway, even his supporters, just not that we don't support him anymore, but just that, I mean, he can only run for one term anyway. I would like to see us all line up around another fighter again, someone like DeSantis. And I don't know how the Never Trumpers are going to be about that, but
Yes, I'm not a DeSantis fan with the don't say gay legislation. I know people say, oh, it doesn't really seem don't say gay, but I have problems with it. I think he really, especially because it was his spokesman, Christina Pusha, I think is the name, who had this thing about how if you oppose this bill, you're a groomer, you're a pedophile trying to lure kids in. And I thought that was it's such a blatant appeal to basically, to anti-gay, religiously motivated anti-homosexual prejudice, that I thought that really is what soured me on DeSantis as an alternative. I mean, I think
that to me, it's like he's fighting fire with fire. That's the same type of stuff they've used.
Fire with fire. I want to say that's the issue that behind it is for me. Is I'm against fighting fire with fire, in the sense that was it the old saying about how if you set out to fight monsters, make sure you not become a monster yourself. There's been way too much on the conservative movement, and it's really become the defining issue, I think, of the Trump era, of the idea that instead of defending the rule of law and individual rights, and instead of defending the rules that we think ought to apply, we have to give up those rules. It's like we have to burn down the village in order to save it. We have to destroy the American system in order to fight these other people who are destroying the American system. We have to destroy it as well, just on our side.
It's almost a message about Shrugged. I mean, she's saying it's better to blow your own stuff up than give it to the looters. And it's meant to be a difference in the slow boil approach of telling them that there's going to be a price for every little thing you do to us. And that's part of how we're defending things like free speech.
Yeah, except the thing is that if you do it wrong, you're not defending free speech. And I think that's become a lot of I'm seeing this a lot on that side, is that the culture war that we have today, people think, oh, this is a new thing that's happened. I remember the culture war from 30, 40 years ago, and it was the same culture war in a lot of ways. And back then it was the moral majority complaining that we're teaching evolution in schools, right? So in the back of my mind, there's that knowledge, and I'm seeing evidence of that out here today, that's happening now, of it's not that you have one side fighting for free speech against the other side that's against free speech. Is what you tend to have is you have the left that's against free speech when because they want to dictate you have to say certain things about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then the right looking for, well, we're going to get power. We're going to punish you for saying things about homosexuals. We're going to punish you for saying things about, the things that we don't like. So, it's there's a very, very old culture war here, which is, free speech for me, but not for thee.
There's a difference in that Christians and conservatives had a lot more cultural power 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. But here's the thing. So I think the thing is that we tend to view them as being sympathetic because, it's the left that has the cultural power now and the Christians have lost it. But at the same time, I look at the Christians and some of the people on the right and know that they're just itching to get that power back so that they can then go back to being the ones who are trying to impose their ideas on us. And I just know there are a lot of, the caution I would have to people to sort of end this, I think, on a note that we can then discuss again later. The caution I would have on this is that to look at some of these people on the right and wonder how open, if they had more power, how open would they be to listening from us atheist objectivists? And I know that, Sohrab Ahmari, if he could ban us, he would ban us in a heartbeat, right? So there's a lot of that going on that, as objectivists, we need to remember. I like the unions had a great slogan that I think we should sort of adapt. Their slogan was, no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And our view should be no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, just permanent principles. And so but I think the urge to say, well, we have to have allies, so let's make allies with the right because, we're against the left. Always be very careful that the people you're allying with on the right will become your enemies again if they are allowed to. So that's and I'm prepared to turn on them if that happens, but I'm just trying to also look at these people saying, you, me, William, Ayn Rand are all racists or anyone for capitalism, and we have no place in their future. That starts to affect the overall threat assessment. It does, but I just, don't forget that it's sort of like, you ally yourself with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. But don't forget that at the same time, you don't want to help them out too much. And what I've noticed is that people tend to be and I am seeing a lot of this, that people tend to be very, especially people who aren't in politics, people tend to be very slow to adjust their evaluations of this sort of thing. That I have a number of subscribers who every time I criticize the right, they're uncomfortable about it because it's like they've got 30 years of these are our allies, this is our side, and therefore I can't hear anything bad about it.
Same with
And
ARI
so,
in some cases.
yeah, and like I said, yeah, that happens. I mean, that people tend to view this sort of idea of this is the side we're on. And they make that evaluation when they're, 20, 30 years ago, and they tend to stay, there's a huge amount of, a huge amount of momentum or inertia is the word I'm looking for. There's a huge amount of inertia on that. And so, I think I'm sort of prepared. You say, we're prepared to turn against the right when they become too powerful. Well, I'm preparing early because I'm anticipating how much momentum, how much inertia we have to how much we have to change in people's mindset, because there are a lot of people who will say, this is my side, and therefore I'm just sticking with it. And even when it changes, it becomes something that's worse and different. I mean, that's how the Democratic Party has survived this long.
Yeah.
Is all the old Democrats who thought that, oh, well, we like them because we're for the unions, and didn't realize that they don't care about, or they're stand up for the working man, not realizing that decades ago the Democratic Party became primarily the party of the college educated left.
Right. I mean, for me, part of the issue is that I saw, in my view of history, is that part of the reason for the rise of the Nazi Party was no one else in Germany standing up against the leftist threat.
Yeah, so my response to that would be, though, but you don't then join the Nazis to fight the leftist threat.
Right, but it's more that we don't stand aside from the right and say, we're not, we're going to tell you you're not doing it right, but then have no influence in how they turn out.
Oh, yeah. And you can't be totally negative. So that gives me a chance to plug one of the other things I'm doing. I think we've plugged my book. So who is John Galt anyway? I'm a writer. I have to turn in my writer's card.
That's all right.
So we've plugged my book. So who is John Galt anyway? Available at Amazon.com. We've plugged my newsletter, Tracinski letter, tracinskiletter.substack.com. And if you don't know how to spell Tracinski, I think you're gonna have it spelled out in the title of this episode. And then the last thing is Symposium, which is another Substack newsletter I'm doing. And Symposium is an effort on my part to go do things like reach out to people, sort of center left people, especially reaching out to the sort of the reasonable, I don't want to say moderate, because moderate isn't the issue, but the reasonable pro-freedom, anti-cancel culture people on the left. The old-fashioned,
like Barry Weiss, the Weinsteins.
Yeah, or I just posted an interview with Steven Pinker about his book on rationality. Okay. So, people like that who are against cancel culture, they're not the crazy leftist culture warriors, but, and have views we would disagree with on economics and a number of other things. And some of that comes out in the interview, but who are generally, who I think Steven Pinker is a great example of someone. I just interviewed him about this book titled Rationality. So something clearly of interest to objectivists. And I think he's an interesting person because he is like making an honest and vigorous attempt to defend reason, but doing it from within a very conventional philosophical framework. And I think that there's some good stuff in that comes from that. And there's some errors that, some inadequacies in it that come from the fact that he's so steeped in a conventional philosophical perspective. But that makes him a very interesting person to engage with. And I think we should be doing what I'm trying to do in response to my concern about the illiberal right, because there's this very openly nationalist, anti-liberal, illiberal in the sense of being anti-freedom. This idea that individualism and freedom are bad, this is a growing impact of that on the right ideologically. And my answer to that is, let's try to find a way so that objectivists and libertarians and classical liberals and these center-left pro-free speech, anti-cancel culture people, let's get us talking to each other and working together and forming our own coalition. So I would like to see, I'm specifically really trying to reclaim the word liberal to mean pro-freedom, what it's supposed to mean. So what I'd like to see is that we have, instead of, do you join team liberal or team team progressive, the team progressive or team conservative, I would like to have it be, well, you can join team liberal. And that we have a new and so my whole goal is to build up that faction and that way of thinking about things, that you don't have to ally with Sohrab Ahmari or Patrick Deneen or these very openly illiberal conservatives. You don't have to ally with them to fight the cancel culture left. You have a pro-liberal, pro-freedom ideology and movement that we can work with. So that's my attempt, is to say, let's try to build this third alternative that will take us more closer and more directly and more safely to where we want to be, which is a free society.
Yeah, and there's a place for all of us building the coalitions we think will have the most impact, and maybe even joining the coalitions one day.
Yeah.
Good. Well, this has been a great conversation. We really touched on a lot of ground. I want to also say again that Rob and I are doing Clubhouse sessions. If you want to come in with something for either one of us, mainly Rob is talking about them. I'm just hosting them. But it's Clubhouse, 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday. And go ahead.
I was going to build next Tuesday, but I'm not sure when this will go up. So
okay, it'll be up today. Yeah, it'll be up. Tomorrow.
So
we'll be having
tomorrow night, next Tuesday, I'm doing a little something on Ayn Rand's view on property rights, her theory of property rights, because I think it's interesting that there's some interesting new things that she did that other people didn't do, but it's also surprisingly diffuse. She never wrote a whole lot directly on property rights. So I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation to have.
Good. That'll be fun. Well, great. Any other final thoughts, William?
Yes. Well, I just want to thank you, Rob, for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you. As I said, you've been an influence on me since the 90s. So I look forward to reading your new book. It sounds really great. On one point on the left versus right, I think Scott and I are mostly siding with the right because we don't see them as the Nazi type of rightist. And I don't even think the Nazis were rightists. They were socialists. So in today's terms, they would be leftists. But I hope you'll think about that and like reevaluate your view of the right, because I don't think they're as bad as the left.
Okay, well, I'll also have you read my newsletter, because I got to document a lot of what's bad about them. So.
Okay.
All right.
Like I said, I think it's great we can have a discussion about this and present the views on either side.
That's right, and no one get excommunicated.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us. Again, it was a great discussion. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schuff, along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.